Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today I've got a CPU benchmark for you, and it's quite unlike anything that we've done before. Some of the testing you're about to see we have touched on in the past, but never before have we tied it all together in a single video. So let me explain. Fundamentally, what we're looking at here is how AMD and Intel 8-core 16-thread processors compare on the most affordable entry-level motherboards, so budget B550 and B560 boards. But not only that, for reference, I've also tested high-end X570 and Z590 boards, and this will allow us to compare how dirt cheap entry-level models compare to flagship versions in terms of CPU performance. The idea came about due to our recent B560 VRM testing, where I found massive performance discrepancies between B560 motherboards depending on their VRM configuration and even the out-of-the-box spec. In short, some of the more expensive B560 boards, think $150 US plus, were up to 50% faster than some of the most affordable entry-level models. Some viewers claim that this really wasn't as shocking as I'd made it out to be, and in fact, this wasn't even an Intel-only issue, claiming entry-level AMD B550 motherboards also suffer from big performance losses with higher-end CPUs. Now, I already knew, at least for the most part, that this claim wasn't accurate, as I've tested VRM performance of roughly 30 AMD B550 motherboards, and none throttled using the Ryzen 9 3950X, a 16-core 32-thread processor. Now, some boards did run excessively hot, but none of them throttled performance, and all were within an acceptable performance delta. As an example, the Gigabyte B550M DS3H, which can be had for just $100 US, ran at up to 96 degrees with the 16-core part installed, but 89 degrees with the 12-core 3900X, and then just 59 degrees with the 3700X, and thermal performance of the newer Ryzen 5000 series is much the same. All that said, Gigabyte makes an even cheaper and crappier B550 motherboard called the B550M S2H, and I picked it up for just $90 Australian, which should amount to around $60 US, so it is a dirt cheap B550 motherboard. It uses a very similar VRM to that of the B550M DS3H, though it is cut down, dropping one of the onsemi 4C06 low side FETs, so this is a very basic 5-phase V-core. So, if you bought this extremely cheap B550 motherboard, how well does it handle the Ryzen 7 5800X, and how much slower is it than the $370 Gigabyte X570 Aorus Master? Then for comparison, we have the Core i7 11700 running on the Gigabyte B560M D2V, as well as the Gigabyte Z590 Aorus Master. I decided to use the X570 and Z590 Aorus Master boards because I bought the B560M D2V and B550M S2H, and I thought it might be best to stick with Gigabyte boards rather than mix and match makers. Now, the reason I've gone with the Core i7 11700 and not the K SKU is because the B560M D2V can't actually run the 11700K without throttling, at least not for extended periods of time. Also, like the majority of B560 motherboards, the D2V adheres to the base TDP spec, so this is the performance you'll receive from this CPU on most B560 boards, unless you manually remove the power limits, which you can do with the D2V, but again it breaks performance as the VRM becomes overwhelmed. It's also worth noting that on an Asus MSI Gigabyte Z590 motherboard, the out-of-the-box performance between the 11700 and 11700K is within 5%. Now, I'm fully aware that most people spending $390 on the Core i7 11700 or $340 on the F SKU will probably be okay spending more than $100 on their motherboard, and would probably opt for something like the $150 Asus TUF Gaming B560M Plus Wi-Fi. Likewise, those spending $400 US on the Ryzen 7 5800X probably won't be looking at the Gigabyte B560M D2V. These motherboards are really for those looking to build a computer for as little as possible, and will likely be going with the Core i3 or Ryzen 3 processor. However, at some point down the track, they may wish to upgrade, and being the frugal PC builders that they are, would no doubt like to avoid replacing their motherboard. So for that potential 8-core 16-thread upgrade, who offers the most value, AMD or Intel? Based on CPU pricing alone, you'd think it'd be Intel, and in a recent top 5 best CPU video, I certainly leant that way more than once. You're looking at $440 for the 11700F/B560M D2V combo, opposed to around $460 to $480 for the 5800X/B550M S2H combo. Now, for those of you seeking an uncapped experience out of the box, we know that the cheapest board to offer that is the $150 Asus TUF Gaming B560M Plus Wi-Fi, which brings the Intel build to $490, about what you'd pay for a 5800X on the Gigabyte B550M DS3H or ASRock B550M Pro 4. But before we start breaking down the value of each option, we really need to go over the benchmark results, so let's do that. For all of this testing, I have changed up our normal configuration a bit. All 4 configurations using the B550, X570, B560 and Z590 motherboards all use the same power supply, memory, cooling and graphics card. Because these budget boards only feature 2 DIMM slots, I've only used 2 memory modules, and therefore we have 16GB of DDR4 3200CL14 dual channel single rank memory. For the power supply, the Corsair RMX 650 has been used, and for the cooling, the Noctua NHD 15. Then for the graphics card, the Gigabyte RTX 3070 Gaming OC was used, and I've gone with the 3070 rather than the 3080 or 3090, as I feel this is a more reasonable level of performance that an entry-level shopper would be aiming for over the next few years. Finally, please note the exact same memory, cooler, power supply, and graphics card were used for each configuration. Okay, let's get into the results. Starting with Cinebench R23, we find that the Ryzen 7 5800X drops in performance from the X570 configuration by roughly 2.5%, scoring 15,133 points on the B550 motherboard. That's not a huge difference, and it's really typical of what we'd expect to see when going from board to board, even when using the same chipset. So I'd say the B550 results are as expected. Now on Intel's side, the Core i7-11700 performance dropped by 26% when using the B560 motherboard, and this is a result of 2 things. Firstly, the cheap B560 board is limited to the TDP specification, whereas the Z590 model isn't, and therefore runs at the default clock multiplier table. Now in some instances, you can simply remove the power limits and restore full performance. But in the case of the B560M D2V, this isn't advisable given the board's VRM really can't handle an unleashed 11700, and therefore will run excessively hot while also throttling performance. So in an effort to rein in the 11700, we see a massive hit to performance. This also means when using expensive motherboards, the 5800X is 10% faster than the 11700 in this test, and that's a reasonable margin indeed, but it's nothing like the 45% difference we see when comparing performance using the budget boards. Now, for a very quick compression test, we see that the performance is much the same with the B550 board, dropping just 3%, and the B560 just 4%. This test was completed in a matter of seconds, so the Core i7-11700 was able to remain in the PL2 power state for the duration of the test. This means for short burst workloads, boards like the B560M D2V will be comparable to expensive Z590 boards in terms of performance. The decompression test takes slightly longer and is also run directly after the compression test, so by this point the 11700 has spent much of its PL2 budget and culling of the clock frequency begins. In the case of the B550 and X570 boards, we see that the 5800X delivered the same level of performance, but the 11700 was 8% slower when using the B560 board, so even in this relatively short benchmark, we are seeing a performance hit. The Blender Open Data benchmark is a core-heavy test, like Cinebench R23, and it runs for over 10 minutes on these 8-core 16-thread processors. This means the 11700 has to revert to its PR1 power state when paired with a board like the B560M D2V, and as a result we see performance drop by 35%. Again, that is a massive performance reduction, and we're not seeing the same with the 5800X, which ran within a 1% variance between the B550 and X570 boards. This means while the 5800X was just 8% faster than the 11700 when running the Intel CPU on the Z590 motherboard, it was 45% faster when using the B560 board. As was seen when testing with 7-zip, not all applications heavily utilize the CPU, or at least don't necessarily do for extended periods of time. Another such application is Photoshop 2020, which typically only uses a few cores, and that means the TDP power budget isn't exceeded here, allowing 1 to 2 cores to run at their maximum frequency indefinitely. And the same was true of the X570 and B550 configurations. So if you're predominantly using software like Photoshop, the motherboard and its VRM doesn't really matter. That said, you've potentially wasted a lot of money on an 8-core CPU that you don't need, and at least in the meantime, aren't using. Next up, we have Adobe After Effects 2020, and this application can lean on the CPU a bit more heavily than what we saw in Photoshop. In the case of the 5800X, the score actually increased by 2% on the B550 board based on a 3-run average, though this is within our margin of error for this test. The 11700 on the other hand saw a performance drop of 7% on the B560 board, and while that's certainly not a significant margin, it is well beyond the margin of error, and clearly suggests that the processor was clocking down in this test when paired with the cheaper motherboard. DaVinci Resolve Studio 16 heavily leverages the GPU, and this takes quite a lot of load off the CPU for editing tasks. As a result, the power-limited B560 board doesn't suffer a performance loss when compared to the more expensive Z590 configuration. We're only talking a mere 3% difference here. That being the case, we also see virtually no performance difference between the AMD boards. Like Resolve, Premiere Pro also offloads a lot of heavy lifting to the GPU, and then the tasks that are CPU intensive typically only leverage a few cores. So this is another example of an application that isn't core heavy, and therefore we see no performance loss when power limiting the Intel processor on the B560 motherboard. Now, when it comes to gaming, it's still a situation where most games don't require a modern 8-core 16-thread processor, so parts like the 5800X and 11700 are much more powerful than what is required. As a result, we see that in this example, the power limiting of the 11700 has no influence on performance, as the CPU is not heavily utilized in F1 2020. Testing with Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege shows very minor reductions in performance in the range of 2%. Meanwhile, the 5800X was a fraction faster on the B550 board, but we're also talking about margin of error here. So again, we have another game where the budget boards are able to match the high-end models even when heavily power limited in the case of the Gigabyte B560M D2V. Horizon Zero Dawn is yet another game that shows comparable performance between the high-end and budget motherboards. Again, the 11700 is able to deliver a similar level of performance on both boards, as the operating frequency remains the same as just a few cores are heavily loaded. Cyberpunk 2077 does utilize the CPU more heavily than the games that we've already looked at, but even here we find identical performance between the high-end and budget motherboards. Watch Dogs Legion is just more of the same. Again, the 11700 isn't maxed out in this title, so therefore the CPU has power budget to spare. Death Stranding is another typical example. This game isn't overly CPU intensive and certainly doesn't max out these modern 8-core 16-thread processors. One of the most CPU demanding games we test with is Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and the village area which we use is much more demanding than other sections of the game, particularly the built-in benchmark, so we always use it for CPU testing. The Ryzen 7 5800X delivered basically identical performance on both the X570 and B550 boards. We're talking about up to a 2.5% deviation. Then on Intel's side, the B560 board was up to 6% slower than the Z590 configuration. Not exactly an extreme drop-off, but it is the biggest we've seen in a gaming situation. Now, our NPC heavy Hitman 2 benchmark is probably the most CPU intensive gaming test we have, and here we do see a 12% reduction in performance for the B560 board when compared to Z590. That's a fairly significant drop-off, and it's far more extreme than the 2% we see for AMD and the 5800X. So this does prove that under CPU demanding gaming conditions, the power limited B560 board will cause a drop in performance. Okay, so here's a look at total system consumption. Now remember, all 4 configurations are using the same memory, graphics card, storage, and power supply. In fact, the only changes have been made to the motherboard and CPU. In the case of the AMD platforms, we found that performance between the B550 and X570 was comparable, and here we're seeing comparable power consumption. The X570 chipset does consume more power, which is why we're looking at around a 15-watt increase in power usage. However, things are much more extreme with Intel. In Blender, we saw a 26% reduction in performance with the B560 motherboard, and while that's certainly a lot, it turns out that this is a far more power efficient configuration, as total system usage dropped by 45%, from a staggering 226 watts to just 124 watts. This is why budget motherboards like the B560M D2V struggle and ultimately fail to handle parts like the 11700 when uncapped. Now, this is really interesting. Total system power consumption in Tomb Raider. Given what we saw in Blender, you might expect the 11700 on the Z590 motherboard to be a bit of a power pig when gaming. But when compared to the Ryzen 7 5800X, it's very similar. In fact, the total system usage only increased by 3%. Again, we're also seeing similar power consumption between the AMD B550 and X570 configurations, with the higher end board consuming around 3% more power. However, there is a much bigger difference when comparing the Intel platforms. The Z590 board consumed 18% more power than the budget B560 board, and that's despite only offering up to 7% more performance in this game. Finally, here's a look at power usage in Hitman 2. This time, the X570 setup used 6% more power than the B550 configuration for what amounted to a 2% increase in performance. The Z590 board, on the other hand, saw total system consumption increase by 14% over the B560 board, which does scale perfectly with the performance uplift of 14%. It's worth noting again though that when it comes to gaming, at least in today's games, the 11700 and 5800X are comparable in terms of power usage. Wrapping up the testing, here's a look at VRM temperatures as well as CPU clock speeds in the Blender Gooseberry test, so a sustained all-core workload. In the case of the Aorus masterboards, the X570 model ran almost 10 degrees cooler, but even at 45 degrees, the Z590 model is overkill, though you can expect it to get a little more toasty when overclocking a Core i9-11900K. Now, when looking at budget boards, the B550M S2H was still able to clock the 5800X at 4.6 GHz, and therefore got the most out of this CPU, and it did so with a VRM temperature of just 68 degrees, which is really very impressive. Like all previous B550 testing, this was conducted inside an ATX case in a 21-degree room, but with the NHD 15 installed. It's worth noting though that the B550M S2H does have a small heatsink installed over the MOSFETs, so that will help a little bit with temperatures. But even so, 4.6 GHz is a terrific result. Especially when you consider the fact that the B560M D2V ran almost as hot at 67 degrees, while clocking the 11700 just shy of 3.4 GHz. It's quite remarkable really that the B550 board manages to run at roughly the same temperature despite the fact that the 5800X is consuming 58% more power, and technically the B560 board does have a more robust VRM featuring extra phase with two high side MOSFETs, and both boards use the same MOSFETs. So that was interesting, and although the results were largely expected given all of our previous testing, it was very interesting to compare these configurations side by side under the exact same test conditions. Now, the first thing I should probably address is the TDP power limited performance of the B560 board versus what we see when not power limited on the Z590 board. As seen in the core heavy workloads, the TDP limited spec does heavily reduce performance, though it does improve efficiency, so there is that. Still, in this example, we found that performance was reduced by a little over 25%, and that was seen in Blender and Cinebench, and that's the kind of drop-off you'd expect to see when going from an 8 to 6-core CPU of similar specifications. However, for the most part, we saw little to no impact on gaming performance, as well as a number of other applications, and as I explained earlier, under these scenarios, the 11700 isn't being heavily utilized, and therefore has enough power budget to run a few select cores at the maximum clock frequency. So it is correct to say that for the most part, the TDP spec doesn't hurt gaming performance, and therefore doesn't matter to gamers. This is certainly a true statement today, but as games inevitably become more CPU demanding, processors like the Core i7-11700 will start to become more heavily utilized, and with more cores requiring more power, the 11700 will be forced to downclock in order to stay within the TDP budget. And when this happens, games will start to suffer from similar performance reductions currently seen in core-heavy applications. So again, while it's true that the TDP limits don't really hurt gaming performance right now, it's unlikely to hold true forever, and that's important to note because without the power limits, the 11700 was just 4% slower than the 5800X in Hitman 2, but as the power limits started to creep in, it became 9% slower, and this is a mild example of what we're likely to see in more demanding games down the track. I think it's fair to say that when it comes to entry-level budget builds, AMD is a much safer option for those who plan to upgrade their CPU in the future and don't want to spend more money changing their motherboard. And again, we're not talking about people buying a Core i7-11700 or Ryzen 7 5800X off the bat, but rather people buying a budget processor. So think Core i3 or Ryzen 3, for example. So if you're looking at buying a Core i3 10100F, for example, for $120 US, and you want to stick it on an inexpensive B560 motherboard like the B560M D2V, but hope in a year or two it'll be possible to pick up something like an 11700 on the cheap to double your core count, is that a good idea? Well, if you plan on heavily using all of those cores, which you probably should, it's not really a great idea as you'll be sacrificing quite a lot of performance. In fact, you'd be better off buying a 6-core 12-thread Ryzen 5 part and sticking that on the B560M D2V, as it can handle those processors without power limits, and performance is comparable to an 8-core 16-thread model with power limits. But the question remains, if you're not going to max out or heavily utilize the 8-core part, then why buy it? Given that logic, the B560M D2V and other low-end B560 motherboards don't really make sense. That means you really want to spend at least $130 US on a B560 board to secure something like the MSI B560M Pro VDH, or perhaps $140 on the Bazooka version. Then on the other side of the fence we have AMD, and we now know beyond a shadow of a doubt that you can purchase any B550 motherboard from the likes of ASRock, Asus, MSI, or Gigabyte, stick a Ryzen 7 5800X on it, and receive maximum performance. And the same is also true for the 12-core Ryzen 9 5900X, though you may run into a small amount of trouble with the 5950X on certain entry-level boards, but that is of course an $800 16-core 32-thread processor. Having said all of that, I've cleared around 30 B550 motherboards to work with the 5950X for extensive all-core workloads, and this includes boards as cheap as $90 US, and really any model priced at or above $120 will work happily with the 16-core processor, while delivering performance that is comparable to the top-end X570 motherboards. I suppose what I'm getting at here is, you can buy virtually any B550 motherboard, and then stick whatever AM4 processor you like on it, and not have to worry about whether or not you're getting maximum performance, so the level of performance that you should get. On the other hand, the Intel B560 platform, it's a real mess. Not only do half the boards run at the TDP spec, with the other half ignoring the power limits altogether and following the default clock multiplier table, which in itself can lead up to a 30 to 50% performance increase with a processor like the Core i7-11700, but on top of that, some boards aren't even good enough to remove the power limits and are therefore locked into the TDP spec, boards like the Gigabyte B560M D2V for example. The most affordable B560 motherboard that can handle parts like the Core i9-11900K and also don't impose power limits out of the box is the Asus TUF Gaming B560M Plus, which was selling for $150 US, though due to limited stock it has crept up to $175 US, but let's stick with the $150 price as presumably it will be back down there soon, and the Asus store still lists that price with a temporary sold out notice. So if you wish to receive maximum performance out of the box, the kind of performance you'll receive with an Asus Gigabyte or MSI Z590 motherboard, then you'll need to spend at least $150 US on a B560 board. And that being the case, the board and CPU combo with the Core i7-11700F comes out to $490 or $325 for the 11400F, which is currently out of stock. On the other hand, if you allow for a budget of $110 for a decent B550 board, the Ryzen 5 5600X combo will cost you $410, and the 5800X, $510. That makes AMD, in my opinion, the better value option for those seeking an 8-core processor, and then of course anything better, while Intel is, in my opinion, the best choice for budget shoppers after a 6-core processor, like the 11400F or 10400F, which is in stock and selling for just $160 US right now. The only consideration being that if you happen to buy an 11400F or 10400F, that's it, you're at the end of the road. At no point do I expect that it'll make sense to upgrade the system with an 8-core processor. In my opinion, you'll likely be starting over with an entirely new platform. In the case of AMD though, if you were to buy, let's say, a 5600X and then upgrade down the track, you could do so to a 5900X or 5950X, and that would net you quite a substantial performance upgrade. The question is though, how cheap will those parts be on the second-hand market in a few years' time? Anyway, that is going to do it for this video. If you enjoyed this look at budget AMD and Intel 8-core CPU performance versus what we see with the higher end boards, then please do give it a like. And if you'd like to become a Hardware Unboxed member by joining us over at Floatplane or Patreon, then please check the links in the video description. And not only will you be supporting work like what we did in this video or the other videos we do on the Hardware Unboxed channel, you also get some pretty awesome perks in return. We have an exclusive Discord server for Hardware Unboxed members, behind the scenes content, Q&As, and we also do a monthly live stream. Tim and myself get together and do that, and we'll be doing that very shortly. But if not, I'd just like to thank you for watching this video. That's fine. Much appreciate your view, and hopefully you found the video useful. Anyway, I'm your host Steve, and I'll see you again next time.